I knew something was wrong before I could explain why, and that's the strange thing about getting older. You stop trusting explanations and start trusting feelings, because feelings arrive early and quietly like a knock you almost ignore. Hahaha, I opened the cabinet the way I always do, slow, careful, already thinking about the small white pill that keeps my chest calm and my nights gentle, and my hand froze midair just there, hovering. Because the bottle wasn't where it always sat, not fallen, not tipped, not misplaced behind something else, just gone, and I stood there longer than I should have, sigh, staring at the empty space like it might explain itself if I waited. My heart doing that soft, uneven thing it does when it doesn't like surprises, and I remember laughing to myself, a small, awkward laugh, because who laughs when they're scared? People who don't want to admit they're scared, that's who. So I told myself it was nothing, that I must have moved it, that age does that to you, moves things in your mind before your hands remember. But even as I told myself that, something inside me whispered no, not like this, forgetting has a softness to it, a foggy feeling. This felt sharp, clean, like someone had been precise, and precision has a weight to it that forgetting doesn't carry. I checked again, then again. Slower this time, moving cups, boxes, old napkins I never use, my fingers starting to shake just enough that I noticed, and that's when my breathing changed, not panic, not yet. Just that tight little band around the ribs that says pay attention, and I sat down because suddenly standing felt unnecessary, like my body wanted me still so my mind could catch up, and that's when he walked in, cheerful, normal. My son with his familiar voice and easy smile asking about my morning, and I mentioned the bottle lightly, the way you mention the weather, just tossing it into the air to see how it lands, and he didn't even pause, didn't even think. Just said it must have been an accident, said maybe I finished it and forgot, said it happens, Mom, especially at your age, ha ha ha, and there it was, that phrase, gentle but heavy, wrapped in concern so no one questions it. And I nodded because nodding is easier than explaining why your chest suddenly feels hollow, and he kept talking, reassuring, calm, telling me he'd help me keep track next time. And I smiled because that's what mothers do when their children think they're helping, even when something feels off, and he hugged me quickly, the careful kind of hug people give when they think you might break. And when he left, the kitchen felt quieter than before, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses on your ears, and I sat there listening to the clock tick, 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 wondering why an accident felt like a decision, and why my hands wouldn't stop trembling. It's funny how the body reacts before the mind has permission. I tried to distract myself, made tea, burned it a little because I forgot it was steeping. Ironic, isn't it? And I told myself, see, you do forget things, maybe he's right, maybe this is just one of those moments, but my chest didn't believe that story. My chest kept reminding me that I'd taken the pill the day before. That I remember the taste, the way it sticks to the tongue if you don't drink enough water. I remember these things because routine is the last thing to leave you. Not memory, routine stays, and that's when the unease settled in, not loud. Not dramatic, just a quiet weight behind the eyes, the kind that makes sleep difficult later, and sure enough that night I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths like I do when my heart flutters. 1, 2 slowed down, and I wondered why I felt watched even though I was alone, why the idea of the cabinet made my stomach tight, and I even laughed softly in the dark, ha 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 ha, at myself, because who gets afraid of a cabinet? Who questions their own child over a missing bottle? That felt dramatic, silly even, and yet the feeling stayed. Like a pebble in your shoe you keep trying to ignore because stopping to remove it feels like admitting the walk is harder than you planned, and the next morning I checked again, hoping it would magically reappear. That I'd feel foolish and relieved, but the space was still empty, clean, untouched, and my breathing hitched just a little, and I realized something then that I didn't want to admit out loud, not yet, not even to myself. Which was this: if it really was an accident, it wouldn't feel like this. Accidents feel messy, confusing, apologetic. This felt neat, finished like a closed door, and as I sat there with the morning light spilling across the counter, I understood that this wasn't about the pill anymore, it was about trust, and once trust shifts, even by an inch, it changes the shape of the room, the sound of voices, the meaning of words like help and care. And I told myself I'd watch, just quietly, no accusations, no drama, because I've lived long enough to know that the truth doesn't like to be chased, it prefers to reveal itself when you give it time. And as I closed the cabinet gently, my hand lingering on the handle longer than necessary, one thought stayed with me, steady and unsettling. And it followed me through the rest of the day like a shadow I couldn't shake. This didn't feel like forgetting at all. After that day, something subtle shifted, not in the house, not in the cabinet, but in the way words were spoken to me, and that's how it always starts, sigh, not with shouting or anger, but with softness. With voices lowered just enough to sound kind, my son began calling more often, asking the same questions in different ways. Did you eat? Did you rest? Did you remember to take everything today? And I answered calmly because calm is what you learn when you've lived a long life. You don't rush to defend yourself. You don't explain every thought. You assume love doesn't need proof, but his concern had a shape to it now, a careful edge. Like someone tracing around you rather than looking at you. And when he came by again, he stood in the kitchen a little longer than usual, his eyes drifting not to my face but to the counters, the drawers, the cabinet, as if the room itself were giving him information, and he smiled when he spoke, that same gentle smile he's had since he was a boy, but his words carried weight. He said maybe we should organize things better. Maybe I'd feel less overwhelmed, maybe it would help if he checked in more, helped manage small things, and I laughed lightly, ha ha ha, because laughing keeps the air light, and I said I wasn't overwhelmed, just tired. Like everyone gets sometimes, but he didn't quite hear that part. Instead he nodded slowly, the way people do when they've already decided what the answer should be. And then came the stories, small ones at first, harmless on the surface. He mentioned how I once misplaced my glasses, how I forgot a call last week, how I repeated myself during dinner, and each time he said it with a softness that made it sound like care. But hearing your life retold through someone else's mouth does something strange to you. It makes you question your own memory, not because you doubt it, but because you start wondering how it looks from the outside. And that's the danger. Not being wrong, but being seen as wrong, and I found myself nodding again, not agreeing, just smoothing the moment, because correcting him felt like making a scene, and I've never liked scenes, not even when I was young. Especially not now, and over the next few days his presence changed. He'd move things while talking, shift a cup, straighten papers I didn't ask him to touch, and each movement felt small, insignificant. But together they formed something heavier, like someone slowly redrawing the map of your space while smiling at you, and he'd say things like, "Let me handle that," or "You don't need to worry about this anymore." And worry is such an interesting word, because once someone says you're worrying too much, they don't need to listen to what you're actually worried about. I noticed my own voice growing quieter, not because I had nothing to say, but because speaking suddenly felt like it required permission, and one evening he asked about the medication again, asked if I was sure I'd taken it properly, and when I said yes confidently, he hesitated just a fraction, then said, "Well, sometimes we think we remember," and I felt something tighten behind my eyes, not tears, not yet, just pressure, because when someone doubts your certainty, they take something invisible from you, something you can't point to. And that night after he left, I sat alone at the table longer than usual, staring at the wood grain, tracing it with my finger like I used to do when I was thinking hard, and I realized that none of his words were cruel. None of them sharp, but together they formed a story where I was slowly becoming unreliable, and the most frightening part was how easy it would be for others to believe it, because society expects that story, it fits neatly, old woman. Fading memory, helpful son, it's familiar, comfortable, no one questions it, sigh, and I wondered then, quietly, what happens when concern turns into control, when help becomes something that takes instead of gives. And I hated that my mind even went there, hated that a part of me wanted to defend him even in my own thoughts, because love makes excuses before logic ever gets a chance, but my body kept reacting, my sleep grew lighter. My chest heavier, and I started noticing how often he spoke for me when others were around, finishing my sentences, explaining my feelings, laughing off my corrections, and each time it happened, a small part of me retreated inward. Not disappearing, just watching, and one afternoon, while he rearranged a drawer without asking, humming softly like this was all normal, I felt a sudden urge, simple and quiet, to write things down, not because I was afraid of forgetting, but because I wanted something solid, something that didn't change tone depending on who was listening. And when he noticed the notebook later and asked what I was writing, I shrugged and said just little things, and he laughed and said, "See, that's a good habit, Mom, helps keep things straight," and his approval sat oddly with me because I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for it, and after he left that day, I opened the notebook again and wrote down not just events, but feelings, the pauses, the looks, the way words were shaped, because feelings don't lie, they just take longer to explain, and as I closed the notebook, I felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity. Like realizing a conversation you thought was shared has actually been one-sided for a while, and the thought that stayed with me that evening, heavy but steady, was this: if someone keeps reminding you that you're slipping, eventually they don't have to push anymore, you start stepping back on your own, and that realization didn't scare me yet, but it did something more important, it woke me up. And I knew then that watching quietly wasn't enough anymore, because when care starts sounding like control, the truth doesn't announce itself loudly, it waits for you to notice who benefits when you begin to doubt yourself. By the third night, my body stopped pretending everything was fine, and that's the thing people don't tell you about getting older, your body becomes honest before your mind is ready to listen. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me, counting the gaps between breaths, feeling my chest tighten and loosen in uneven rhythms, not enough to send me into panic, not enough to call anyone. but enough to keep me awake, enough to make sleep feel like something just out of reach. And I remember whispering to myself, "It's okay, just breathe," like I used to do when my son was little and scared of thunderstorms. Funny how the words circle back, except this time I was saying them to myself, and the house felt too quiet, not peaceful, just hollow. And when I finally drifted off, it wasn't rest, it was that thin, fragile kind of sleep where you wake up more tired than before, and in the morning my chest felt heavy, not painful, just burdened, like carrying a bag you forgot you were holding, and I sat at the edge of the bed longer than usual, letting my feet find the floor slowly, because standing too fast made the room tilt slightly, not spinning, just leaning, and that scared me more than dizziness ever could. Because it felt like my body was quietly protesting something it hadn't agreed to, I shuffled to the kitchen and made tea, my hands shaking just enough to spill a little water, and I laughed softly at that. Ha ha ha, because if you don't laugh, you start crying, and I wasn't ready for crying yet. And as I waited for the kettle, I felt that same tight band around my ribs again, the one that shows up when my medication is late. Familiar but unwelcome, and my mind finally allowed the thought it had been avoiding. This isn't imagination, this is chemistry, this is absence, and I sat down at the table and pressed my palm flat against my chest, breathing slow and careful, listening to my heart like it might explain itself if I paid enough attention, and all morning my body kept score, the slight shortness of breath when I walked from room to room, the faint tremor in my fingers when I lifted my cup. The way fatigue settled in my bones earlier than it should have, and with each sensation came a whisper, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Something is missing, and I thought about calling my son, but the thought made my stomach tighten. Not because I didn't love him, but because I knew what he'd say, he'd worry, he'd reassure, he'd explain it away, and somehow his explanations made me feel smaller, like my experience needed permission to exist, so I didn't call. Instead, I sat by the window and watched people pass by, neighbors walking dogs, a woman pushing a stroller, life moving on without noticing the quiet negotiation happening inside my chest. And I wondered how many people carry things like this without anyone knowing, how many warning signs go unnoticed because they don't look dramatic enough. Sigh, by afternoon I was tired in a way that felt earned but unfair. And when my son came by again that evening, I tried to hide it, straightened my shoulders, smiled, joked about not sleeping well because of a silly dream, and he watched me carefully, too carefully, asked if I felt dizzy. Asked if my breathing was okay, and when I said I was fine, he nodded but didn't quite believe me, and that disbelief settled between us like a third presence at the table, and he suggested maybe I should rest more. Maybe I was pushing myself, and I wanted to tell him that rest doesn't fix missing medicine, but the words felt heavy, so I swallowed them, and after he left, the quiet returned, heavier than before, and I sat alone with my thoughts. My notebook open in front of me, and for the first time I wrote down how my body felt, not just what happened, but how it felt, chest tight at 10 a.m., dizzy at noon, breath shallow by evening. Because writing it made it real in a way words spoken aloud never could, and as I wrote, tears finally came, not loud sobbing, just slow, quiet tears that slipped down without permission. Weeping the way you do when you're exhausted and scared and trying to be brave all at once, and I wiped them away quickly, almost embarrassed, even though no one was there to see. Old habits die hard. And that night sleep avoided me again, my heart racing and settling and racing again, like it couldn't decide whether to sound an alarm, and I sat up in bed, breathing carefully, reminding myself I was still here. That this wasn't an emergency yet, but something else crept in alongside the fear, clarity, slow and unwelcome. Because as I lay there listening to my heartbeat, I realized my body wasn't confused, it wasn't forgetting. It was responding exactly as it should when something essential is taken away, and that thought stayed with me into the morning, heavy but steady. And when dawn finally crept through the curtains, pale and quiet, I made a decision, not a loud one. Not a dramatic one, just a calm, deliberate choice. I needed answers, not reassurance, not explanations, answers rooted in something outside of feelings and assumptions, because feelings had already done their job, they had warned me. And now it was time to listen to facts, and as I sat at the table sipping my tea slowly, feeling my chest rise and fall with careful effort, one thought settled firmly in my mind. Clear as anything I'd felt in days, if my body was reacting this strongly, then somewhere, quietly and deliberately, the truth was already written down, waiting for me to find it. I didn't wake up that morning feeling brave or determined. I woke up feeling tired in a way that seeps into your bones, the kind that makes even simple decisions feel heavy. Sigh, but there was also something else there. A quiet firmness, like a chair pulled out and waiting, and after breakfast I stood in the hallway for a long moment holding my purse, staring at the door as if it might argue with me. Funny how leaving your own house can feel like crossing a line you didn't know existed, and I told myself I was just going for a walk, just stretching my legs, nothing serious. But my feet carried me in a direction my mind had already chosen, slow and steady toward the pharmacy 3 blocks away, the same one I've used for years, the same one where they know my name and ask about the weather. And the air felt heavier than usual, thick with the smell of rain that never quite falls, and halfway there I had to stop at the corner, not because I couldn't go on, but because my chest asked me to pause, so I did, breathing carefully. Counting like always, 1, 2, steady now, and as I stood there watching cars pass, I wondered if this was how answers begin, quietly with small pauses and unremarkable sidewalks. And when I finally reached the pharmacy and pushed the door open, the bell chimed softly, that familiar sound that usually makes me feel safe, and the young woman behind the counter smiled kindly. The kind of smile people give when they want to be gentle without saying why, and she asked how she could help, and my voice surprised me by sounding calm when I said I needed a refill, that my medications seemed to be missing. And she nodded and typed, her fingers quick and confident, and I watched her face change in the smallest way, just a slight tightening around the eyes, the smile fading a fraction, and she paused, then looked back at the screen. And I felt my stomach sink before she even spoke, because pauses speak loudly when you're waiting for truth. And then she said the word, not loud, not dramatic, just placed carefully between us like something fragile, canceled. And for a second I didn't understand, I even smiled a little, ha ha ha, because sometimes your mind refuses to catch up right away, and I said, no dear, that can't be right, I didn't cancel anything, and she looked at me again. Her expression softening and turned the screen slightly, not enough for me to read details, but enough for me to see the confirmation, the neat little line that said it had been canceled days ago, and the room seemed to tilt, not spin. Just shift like the ground moved an inch without warning, and my chest tightened hard enough that I had to place a hand over it, breathing slow and careful, all because that word, canceled, carried weight. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't forgetting, it was action, and I asked her when, my voice quieter now, and she told me the date, and that date landed in my mind with a dull thud because I knew it. I knew exactly what day that was. It was the day my son had come by unannounced, the day he insisted on helping, the day he stood in my kitchen longer than necessary, and suddenly the pieces that had been floating loosely snapped together with a clarity that made my eyes sting. And I thanked the pharmacist, even smiled, because politeness is a reflex you don't lose easily, and I told her I'd look into it, and she offered to help, offered to call someone, but I shook my head, not yet. Because I needed to carry this thought home carefully, like a glass filled too high, and the walk back felt longer, not because my legs were tired, but because my mind was loud, replaying moments I'd brushed aside, his hand near the counter. His voice reassuring, the way he spoke for me, and I realized something as I walked, something heavy and cold, which was that accidents don't cancel prescriptions, forgetting doesn't log into systems. And the idea that someone had acted in my name without my knowledge sent a quiet shiver through me, not fear exactly, more like disbelief settling into acceptance, and when I reached my house and closed the door behind me, the familiar walls didn't feel comforting anymore, they felt watched, like the room itself remembered things I was only just learning, and I sat at the kitchen table and let myself breathe, slow and deep, waiting for the shaking to pass. And that's when the thoughts started lining up, neat and unavoidable. He had been here that day, he knew my routine, he knew my medication mattered, and still, I didn't want to believe it, not fully, not yet, because belief changes things. Belief demands action, and I wasn't ready for that, so instead I reached for my notebook, my small quiet companion, and wrote down the date, the word canceled, the time the pharmacist mentioned. My handwriting a little shaky but legible, and as I wrote, something steadied inside me because facts have weight, they don't float away like feelings do, and I sat there a long time, listening to the house settle, the clock ticking, the refrigerator humming, and I thought about how easily my story could have ended differently, how easily this could have been dismissed as confusion, and a soft laugh escaped me. Not because it was funny, but because of how close I'd come to doubting myself, and by evening my son called, cheerful as ever, asking how my day went, and I said it was fine, because I needed to hear his voice now, needed to listen for something beneath the words. And when he spoke, nothing sounded different, which was the most unsettling part of all, because if he had raised his voice, hesitated, slipped, it would have been easier, but instead he sounded normal, loving, concerned, and when we hung up, I stared at the phone and felt a strange mix of sadness and clarity, because the truth doesn't always come with drama, sometimes it arrives quietly, in a single word spoken by a stranger behind a counter. And that night as I lay in bed, breathing carefully, my chest still heavy but steadier, one thought circled in my mind, relentless and calm. And it kept me awake longer than the pain ever could. If a prescription could be canceled without my knowledge, then somewhere there had to be a record of how, when, and by whom, and I knew, with a certainty that made my heart beat faster, that I hadn't reached the end of this story yet, not even close, because whatever happened next would be written down, waiting, and I was finally ready to look at it. I didn't rush back to the pharmacy the next day, not because I didn't want answers, but because answers change you, and I needed one quiet morning to sit with what I already knew. Sigh, I woke early, my chest still heavy but steadier. like it had decided to cooperate now that my mind was finally listening, and I made tea and sat at the table with my notebook open, staring at the word cancelled written in my own hand. Tracing the letters slowly as if they might soften, but they didn't. They stayed sharp, honest, and by mid-morning I knew delaying wouldn't protect me. It would only protect whatever truth was hiding, so I put on my coat, slipped the notebook into my purse, and walked back to the pharmacy with a kind of quiet purpose that surprised me. Not anger, not fear, just resolve. And when I walked in, the same gentle bell rang. And the same pharmacist looked up and recognized me, and her face told me she remembered our conversation, remembered the pause, remembered the way my hand had pressed to my chest, and she didn't ask why I was there this time. She simply nodded and asked me to follow her to a small room near the back, a private space with 2 chairs and a desk, the kind meant for conversations that shouldn't be overheard. And as we sat down, she folded her hands and spoke softly, like she was afraid of breaking something fragile, and I told her I needed to see more than just the cancellation, that I needed to understand what happened. And she hesitated just a moment before turning the screen toward me fully, not half, not angled, but open, and that gesture alone made my throat tighten, because it felt like respect. Like she believed me before I'd finished explaining, and what I saw there looked ordinary at first. Lines of text, dates, times, nothing dramatic, but as she scrolled slowly, my stomach dropped, because there it was, clear as day. A record of activity, logins I didn't recognize, timestamps that meant nothing to me until she read them aloud, and my heart began to pound, not wildly, just firmly, each beat landing heavy in my chest. And she explained it simply, no technical words, no confusion, just facts. The account had been accessed remotely more than once, and the cancellation had been processed from a device not linked to mine, and I remember laughing softly then. Ha ha ha, not because it was funny, but because it finally made sense, the precision, the neatness, the way it didn't feel like forgetting, because it wasn't, it was deliberate, and I told her I don't use the online system. That I wouldn't know how, and she nodded, said she already suspected that, and pointed to another line, a failed login attempt followed by a successful one, both on the same afternoon, and that afternoon burned bright in my memory, the visit. The reorganizing, the way my son stood too close while I washed a cup, his phone lighting up in his hand, and I felt something cold slide into place inside me. Not panic, not rage, just clarity, sharp and unmistakable. And I asked if I could have a copy, my voice steadier than I expected, and she printed the records without question, the paper warm when she handed it to me, and I held it carefully, like holding proof in my hands might change its weight. And she asked if I was safe, and that question nearly broke me, not because I wasn't safe, but because no one had asked it before, and I nodded and thanked her, my eyes stinging, and when I walked out of the pharmacy, the sunlight felt harsher than usual, like the world hadn't adjusted to the truth I was carrying, and the walk home felt different this time, each step deliberate, grounded, as if my feet knew something my heart was still catching up to. And inside the house, I laid the papers out on the table and read them slowly, one line at a time, my finger following each timestamp, each action, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, because the truth, once seen, doesn't shout. It simply is, and I thought about all the moments I'd doubted myself, all the times I'd nodded just to keep the peace, and a quiet sadness washed over me, because I realized how easily I could have been erased from my own story. How easily this could have ended with people saying she was confused, she imagined it, and I whispered to myself, not this time, not quietly, not without a record, and later that afternoon my son stopped by again, cheerful as ever, asking how I felt, and I watched him differently now, listened not just to his words but to the spaces between them, and when he asked about my medication, I said calmly that I was handling it, and he smiled. That same reassuring smile, and I felt a flicker of grief, because the person he was being in that moment didn't match the records on my table, and after he left I sat alone again, the papers still spread out before me. And I pressed my palm flat against them, grounding myself, and I thought about how proof changes things, not immediately, not loudly, but permanently, and I realized then that the most dangerous lie isn't the one told out loud. It's the one people assume because it feels familiar, and that night, as I carefully folded the records and placed them inside my notebook, my chest felt steadier than it had in days, not because the situation was resolved, but because I finally knew where I stood, and as I turned off the light and lay down, breathing slow and even, one thought stayed with me, calm and certain, carrying me toward whatever came next. He thought there was no proof. But the truth had been sitting there all along, quietly waiting for me to look. By then, the story inside me had grown heavier than the papers tucked into my notebook, and that surprised me, because I thought proof would feel like relief, like a door opening. But instead it felt like standing in a room where the lights have just come on and you realize how long you were sitting in the dark. Sigh, I moved through the day carefully, not hiding, not confronting, just observing. Every sound sharper now, every word carrying a second meaning, and I noticed how often my son checked his phone when he was with me, how quickly he reassured himself when I said I was fine. How his kindness had started to feel like supervision, and that realization hurt more than the missing medication ever did, because medicine affects the body but trust affects the soul. I found myself talking less, listening more. Not because I was afraid, but because listening shows you what people think you don't hear, and in the quiet moments when the house settled and my breath finally slowed, I felt something new begin to rise alongside the fear. A kind of steady awareness, like waking up after a long afternoon nap and realizing it's much later than you thought, and I wondered how many other people live inside moments like this. Moments where something feels wrong but no one believes them because the wrong thing wears a friendly face, and I thought about how loneliness doesn't always come from being alone. Sometimes it comes from being surrounded by people who don't really see you, ha ha ha, and that thought stayed with me as I sat at the table one evening, the notebook open, the papers still folded neatly inside, my hands resting on the wood. Feeling its familiar grooves, and I realized something important then, something I hadn't planned, which was that if this story was happening to me, quietly, slowly, then it was happening to others too, people whose voices shake. People who are told they're confused, people who are dismissed with smiles and gentle words, and I felt a soft ache in my chest, not the dangerous kind, but the emotional one. The kind that comes when you recognize yourself in something larger, and I whispered to the empty room, "You're not crazy, not weak, not imagining this," and the words felt grounding. Like saying them out loud stitched something back together inside me, and if you're listening to me right now, wherever you are, maybe you felt that too, maybe you felt someone slowly take control of your life while calling it care. And if these quiet stories matter to you, if you believe voices like mine deserve space, then maybe stay with me, subscribe, not because I need numbers, but because there are more truths like this. And sometimes it helps to know you're not alone while listening to them, and after that thought passed, I breathed out slowly, letting the room return to silence, because the tension hadn't disappeared, it had just changed shape. And when my son visited again, his questions came softer but more frequent, and I answered calmly, evenly, no anger in my voice, because anger would only give him something to point to, and I watched his eyes flick to the cabinet, then away. Watched how his shoulders tightened when I mentioned the pharmacy casually, and I didn't say anything yet, not because I was afraid, but because timing matters and rushing truth can make it easier to deny, and later that night. As I lay in bed listening to my heart finally settle into a steadier rhythm, I realized that awareness had given me something I hadn't felt in days. Control, quiet control, not over him, not over the situation, but over myself, and that kind of control doesn't announce itself, it simply sits with you, calm and patient, waiting for the moment when silence will speak louder than any accusation. And as I drifted toward sleep, my breathing slow, and even for the first time in what felt like weeks, one thought wrapped around me like a steady hand, because the hardest part wasn't finding the proof, it was knowing exactly who the proof pointed to. I didn't plan the moment the way people imagine confrontations are planned, with speeches and raised voices and perfectly chosen words. It happened the way most real things do, quietly, almost accidentally. On an afternoon that looked ordinary from the outside, and maybe that's why it worked, because there was no drama to hide behind, my son came over with the same familiar knock, not loud, not rushed, just confident. Like someone who believes they belong wherever they stand, and I let him in without hesitation, because hesitation would have given away that something was different, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he did homework as a boy. The same one where I taught him how to fold his napkin, and he talked first about work, about being tired, about worrying too much, and I listened, nodding at the right moments, smiling softly, letting the rhythm of normalcy lull him into comfort, and when he finally asked how I was feeling, really feeling, I told him the truth calmly, that my breathing had been off, that I hadn't been sleeping well, and he frowned in that practiced way. The worried son expression he wore so convincingly, and he said maybe stress was getting to me, maybe I was imagining connections that weren't there, and that was when I reached for my notebook, not suddenly, not dramatically. Just the way you reach for your glasses when you want to see clearly, and his eyes followed the movement without meaning to, and I opened it slowly, letting the papers inside show themselves one by one. And I placed them on the table between us, not pushing them toward him, not pulling them back, just letting them exist, and for a moment he didn't understand what he was looking at, his face relaxed, neutral, and I said quietly, "The pharmacy printed these for me," and that was all, no accusation, no anger, just a statement, and he leaned forward instinctively, scanning the lines, and I watched his face change in stages, curiosity first, then confusion. Then something else, something tighter, his jaw setting, his breath slowing, and I felt a strange sadness then, because I recognized that look. It was the look of someone realizing a story they believed was no longer holding together. And I said nothing, because silence can be more honest than words, and as he read, his fingers stopped moving, hovering over one line then another, and he swallowed hard enough that I heard it, and when he finally looked up at me. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again, and that silence, that sudden, unexpected silence, filled the room like a weight dropping. Oh, it wasn't anger, it wasn't shouting, it was the absence of excuses. The moment when rehearsed explanations failed to arrive, and I felt my chest tighten, not from fear but from grief, because in that quiet I lost something I didn't know I was still holding on to. The belief that this had all been a misunderstanding, and I waited not because I wanted him to speak, but because I wanted to see if he could, and he couldn't. His eyes moved from the papers to my face and back again, searching for something to grab onto, and I realized then how powerful proof is when it doesn't need to be defended. And finally, he whispered something about it being complicated, about systems making mistakes, about not remembering exactly, and I listened without interrupting, because his words sounded thin even to him, and when he stopped talking, the silence returned, heavier this time, and I said gently, "I didn't cancel my medication." And that sentence felt like setting something down after carrying it too long, and he nodded slowly, not agreeing, not denying, just acknowledging that the ground had shifted, and for a long moment neither of us moved. The kitchen clock ticking loudly in the background, and I felt tears gather, not spilling, just sitting there, because confrontation isn't satisfying when it involves someone you love, it's just sad, and eventually he stood up. His movements stiff, his face pale, and said he needed air, needed time to think, and I watched him leave without trying to stop him, because stopping him would have meant comforting him, and I wasn't ready to do that yet. And when the door closed behind him, the house felt strangely still, not empty, just settled, like something important had finally been said without being spoken, and I sat back down at the table. My hands shaking now that the moment had passed, and I laughed softly through the tremor, ha ha ha, because I'd expected shouting, denial, tears, but what I got instead was silence, and that silence told me everything words never could. Because when someone goes quiet in the face of truth, it means they know exactly what it says. After he left, I didn't feel the rush of victory people imagine comes with being proven right. There was no relief flooding my chest, no sense of triumph, just a long, slow exhale that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than my lungs. Sigh, the house felt different then, not quieter but heavier with understanding, and I sat at the same table staring at the place where the papers had been, my fingers tracing the faint ring left by his coffee cup. And I realized something that hurt more than the missing medication ever could. This wasn't about anger or even betrayal in the way people usually mean it. It was about control, quiet, careful control. The kind that wears kindness like a coat and calls itself love. I thought back over the months, the small comments, the gentle corrections, the way he'd finish my sentences or answer questions meant for me. The way concern slowly turned into supervision, and I felt a soft ache spread through my chest, not the dangerous kind this time, but the emotional one, the kind that makes your eyes burn and your throat tighten. All because it meant admitting that someone I raised with patience and care had begun to see me as a problem to manage rather than a person to respect. And I understood then how easily love can twist when fear gets involved. Fear of responsibility, fear of loss, fear of watching a parent age and realizing you can't fix it, so instead you try to control it, and control feels productive, it feels like action. Even when it harms the very person it claims to protect, and I found myself defending him even in my thoughts, saying he didn't mean it, he was just trying to help, he was scared, and then I stopped. Because excusing behavior doesn't make it disappear, it just makes it repeat, and that realization settled heavily, like realizing you've been carrying someone else's fear along with your own, and I walked slowly through the house that evening, touching familiar things, the back of the chair, the edge of the counter, grounding myself in what was still mine, and I noticed how often I'd begun to hesitate before simple actions, how I'd grown used to being watched, corrected, redirected. And that frightened me more than the missing pills ever had, because it meant I'd started shrinking without noticing. And shrinking happens quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It just asks you to give up small pieces of yourself until one day you look around and realize you're standing in a much smaller life. And I sat on the edge of the bed later, rubbing my hands together to warm them. And let myself cry then, really cry, slow, quiet weeping that shook my shoulders just enough to release what I'd been holding back, not because I felt weak, but because grief needs somewhere to go. And what I was grieving wasn't just trust, it was the version of my son I thought I still had, the one who saw me as steady, capable, whole, and letting go of that image felt like another kind of loss. One that didn't come with casseroles or condolences, and as the tears faded, a strange calm took their place, because understanding brings its own stillness, and I realized I didn't hate him, I didn't even feel anger the way I expected. What I felt was clarity, clear and sharp and sad like cold air on your face, and clarity doesn't shout, it simply rearranges things inside you. And I thought about how often older people are told to be grateful for help without being asked if they want it, how easily independence is mistaken for stubbornness. and how dangerous it becomes when someone decides they know what's best for you without listening to what you're saying. Sigh, I remembered a conversation years ago with a friend who'd said the hardest part of aging wasn't the body slowing down, it was people starting to talk over you, and I hadn't understood it then, but I did now deeply. And that night I didn't sleep much, not because my chest was tight, but because my mind was busy untangling years of small moments that suddenly made sense, and in those quiet hours I made a promise to myself, not dramatic. Not loud, just firm. I would not disappear quietly. I would not let love be used as a reason to erase my voice. And the next morning, when the light came in soft and pale through the curtains, I felt older, yes, but also steadier. Like someone who has finally named what's been pressing on them for too long. And as I moved through my routine, slow and careful, I understood that what had happened wasn't a sudden act of cruelty, it was a gradual shift. A slide from care into control, and naming it gave me back something important. Choice, and choice at my age is everything, because once you lose the right to decide for yourself, even in small ways, everything else becomes easier for others to take. And as I sat there with my tea warming my hands, my breathing steady, my heart calm, one thought stayed with me, heavy but grounding. And it carried me forward into whatever came next. I didn't lose my son that day, but I did lose the version of him who trusted my strength, and I wasn't going to pretend that didn't matter. Once I named what was happening, truly named it, not softened it, not explained it away, something inside me shifted from watching to acting, and that surprised me. Because action at my age is supposed to look loud or desperate in people's minds. But this wasn't either. It was quiet, practical, almost boring, and that's what made it powerful. I didn't storm into offices or make emotional phone calls. I made lists, small, neat ones, the kind I used to make when my son was young and life felt busy but manageable. And the first thing on that list was simple. Protect what keeps me alive, so I went back to the pharmacy, not shaken this time, not searching but steady, and I asked calmly what steps could be taken so no one but me could touch my prescriptions. And the pharmacist listened without interrupting, her eyes kind but serious, and she explained the options slowly, clearly, no rushing, and I nodded, asking questions, the right questions, the ones that show you're present, and by the time I left, changes were already in place, no remote cancellations, no online access without my presence, nothing that could be done quietly behind my back again, and as I walked home, the air felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because the ground under my feet felt solid again. Next I did something I'd avoided for days. I told someone else, not for validation, not for sympathy, but for record. Because truth becomes safer when it's shared with the right ears, and that meant making a call I hadn't planned to make, one that made my hand pause over the phone longer than I expected, but when I finally dialed, my voice came out calm and I explained simply that I needed advice, not drama, and that conversation, quiet and professional, did more to steady me than any reassurance ever could. Because it reminded me that independence doesn't mean doing everything alone, it means choosing who stands with you, and after that I came home and changed one more thing, something small but deeply symbolic. I moved my medication into a locked box, nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just something that required my hands and my choice to open, and when I closed it for the first time, the click sounded louder than it should have. Like a line being drawn, and I stood there for a moment, breathing it in, that simple sound of safety. And over the next few days I noticed changes, not just around me, but in me. I stopped hesitating before taking my pill. Stopped checking the cabinet with dread, stopped listening for footsteps that weren't there, and my body responded almost immediately. My breathing eased, my chest loosened, my sleep grew deeper, and that alone told me I'd done the right thing. Because the body doesn't lie when it feels safe, and when my son called, his voice sounded uncertain for the first time, not confident, not guiding, just unsure, and he asked how I was doing, really doing. And I told him honestly that I was better, stronger, more settled, and there was a pause on the line, a long one, and I didn't rush to fill it, because silence had become my ally, and when he finally spoke, his tone was softer, less sure of itself. And I felt something inside me relax because power had shifted, not through confrontation, but through boundaries. I didn't lecture him, didn't accuse, didn't list everything I'd done, I simply lived differently. And living differently is often the clearest message of all, and one afternoon, as I sat by the window watching light move slowly across the floor, I realized something that felt almost like peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being perfect, but the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer vulnerable in the same way, and I laughed softly to myself, because I hadn't taken back control by force or anger. I'd taken it back by choosing myself, and that felt quietly powerful, and as evening settled and I prepared for bed, my routine steady and unhurried, I felt my heart beat calmly, evenly. Like it remembered what it was supposed to do all along, and I understood then that safety doesn't come from trust alone, it comes from protection, and protection isn't punishment, it's care directed inward, and as I turned off the light, The darkness felt different now, not threatening, not watchful, just quiet, and one thought stayed with me as I drifted toward sleep, calm and certain, like a hand resting gently on my shoulder. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't afraid, I was finally safe. The house felt different in the days that followed, not because anything around me had changed, but because I had, and that's the kind of change no one notices right away. Sigh, the chairs sat where they always had. The light came in through the same windows, the clock kept ticking at the same steady pace, but I moved through the rooms with a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in a long time, and my body seemed to know it too, my breathing steady. My heart calm, my sleep deeper, as if everything inside me had finally agreed on the same rhythm again. I made my tea each morning without that small knot of worry in my stomach, took my medication without hesitation. Without counting and recounting, and that simple act felt like reclaiming something sacred, and I thought often about how close I'd come to disappearing into someone else's version of my life. How easily it could have happened if I'd stayed silent, if I'd laughed things off one more time, if I'd trusted reassurance over evidence, and that realization didn't fill me with bitterness. It filled me with respect for myself. Because surviving something quietly doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous, it just means you were paying attention. My son called more carefully now, his words slower, his questions less leading, and when he visited, he watched me instead of managing me, and that shift told me more than any apology could have, because real change doesn't arrive in speeches, it arrives in behavior, and we didn't talk about the records again, we didn't need to. They had done their work, and what remained was something more honest. Space, I've learned, is sometimes the most loving thing you can give someone, and in that space I found my voice again, not louder, not sharper, just steadier. And I used it when I needed to, without explanation, without defense, and one afternoon, sitting by the window with the sun warming my hands, I thought about all the people who might be listening to a story like mine and wondering if they're overreacting, if they're imagining things, if they should just be grateful and quiet, and I wanted to reach through the air and say no. Gently but firmly, you're allowed to notice when something feels wrong, you're allowed to protect yourself even if it makes others uncomfortable, ha ha ha, and if my voice has kept you company through this. If it made you pause or nod or breathe a little deeper, then maybe stay with me, subscribe, because there are more stories like this, quiet ones, important ones, and they deserve to be heard. And as evening settled in and the house grew still, I wrote one final line in my notebook, my hand steady, my heart calm, I remained myself, and that sentence felt like a promise kept, not just to me, but to the life I've lived, and I turned off the light and let the darkness come. Not as something to fear, but as rest, and for the first time in a long while the quiet didn't warn me of anything at all, it simply held me, and I slept peacefully knowing that dignity, once reclaimed, doesn't need to shout, it just stays.